Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our Japanese Politics 101 room. Every Sunday, Timothy Langley, who runs a company in Tokyo that focuses exclusively on Japanese politics, government and public affairs, and host Paya Matsuoka, bring to you the latest developments in Japanese politics. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Timothy, let's start.
Thank you very much, Maya. So thank you everyone for joining us. This is our 45th consecutive week. President Trump was the 45th president. Next week will be our 46th. Joe Biden is our 46th president. So everything is coming into a kind of a relevant fold here. We're going to close up the year, but I don't think, Maya, we have talked much about our continuing efforts to keep this room going, and there's always something to talk about from week to week. I really appreciate people dialing in because there is a lot of stuff going on that should get a little bit more airtime, and I will try and deal with that in this briefing and in the briefings going forward. But I think we've got a New Year's holiday coming up. I think, Maya, we discussed that we're going to still have a room on New Year's. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. That will be January the 2nd. So, well, it's going to be our regular room on Japanese politics. But of course, everybody's welcome to join us and celebrate the New Year there as well.
Okay, great. So there's a lot of things that the absence of the diet being held. There's lots of things that are going on in defense and economy and in trade and tourism, that sort of thing. So let me just start with what's going on with Mr. Kishida, what's going on with his administration. And I'd like to talk about that. I'd like to talk about COVID, some movement going on there with the Moderna approval. There's some things going on in Japanese politics that are being revealed separate from what's going on in the diet. For example, there was a little bit of movement in the Moritomo Gakuen scandal just this last week. I'd like to talk about that. And in conjunction with that and the kind of questioning that creates in people's minds about the Japanese government and how they ethically handle problems was also the revelation by Mr. Kishida of apparently doctoring documents from the Ministry of Construction for many, many years, which inflated Japan's GDP. I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Then some things with Japan's defense and the Constitutional Reform Committee. So that committee met just this last week, and there's been some movement there, not only with that, but also with Foreign Minister Hayashi. I'd like to talk about go-to travel. We've got the border. It's not quite border closing, but it's almost like border closing until December 31st. And there should be some movement there, but there's also talk in anticipation of this thing slowly dying down and the relaunch of the go-to travel. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. And then finally, I'd like to just wrap up today's briefing with a kind of a thermometer read on what's going on within within LDP factional politics. Just very briefly there hasn't been a lot of movement, but I think we need to constantly keep checking in on that because with the LDP in such a strong position within diet deliberations, what's going on within the factions is very, very important. And it also suggests to us what's going to be happening as we get closer to the summer upper house elections. So with that, let me start off with the extraordinary diet session, which concludes on Tuesday. The main issue of the extraordinary diet session was to discuss and talk about and settle issues with the supplementary budget. They just passed that with the lower house. So the lower house deliberates it, talks about it first. The bill goes to the upper house, and the upper house has a few days to discuss it, deliberate it, and then pass on it. And if it doesn't pass, then the decision of the lower house actually holds sway. So this is one of those instances where the distinction between the lower house and the upper house is pretty important. But this extraordinary diet session, as it stands right now, will pass a supplementary budget. The numbers are so huge, it's difficult to kind of comprehend them. But 316 trillion yen has been earmarked for supporting COVID restructuring. That means not only just the booster shots and preparing for potentially other variants coming up, but to supplement hospitals and devices and healthcare, that sort of thing, but also to get the economy going with easier money for companies that are suffering, and also, for example, restarting Go2, which is something we talked about just very briefly. And I'll wait until later to get into it a little bit more in detail. And I think Maya, you can contribute to that discussion because that's really in your area as well. Since we talked last week, Mr. Kishida has been peppered with a couple of issues that zing him. They're paper cuts basically, but they do indicate, maybe his lack of experience so far as the nation's leader. And these kinds of things are to be expected from time to time. But let me just talk about the biggest three that have come up. And one of them is the dance between giving out money to people who have children under the age of 18. This was initiated as a election campaign theme, mostly by Komeito, the coalition partner of the LDP. And it gained a lot of momentum until after the election. Then they began to put brass tacks together. And initially it was, let's give, gomayen to the families per child, and then give them gomayen worth of coupons afterwards. The gomayen, the 50,000 yen, would come in before the end of the year. So that's very close. And that's why one of the reasons they had to rush through this supplementary budget. And there was a lot of debate about this, how we get money into the economy. Many analysts said through experience that if you give people the money, they're just going to save it. People that are in that kind of a financial condition where they have one or two kids, they're under 9.6 million annual yen income. They're probably going to squirrel away the money rather than spend it. So they came up with the idea, let's give them some cash and then let's dedicate the rest to coupons, because that actually begins to filter into the economy. And there's been a lot of debate over that. And finally, the decision was, let's just give them the cash. So this isn't what the prime minister initially wanted. It's something that he fought against, but he basically collapsed. And so before the end of the year, families who have kids who meet a certain income criteria and have children under 18 will receive Jumayen, 100,000 yen, in cash before the end of the year. So that's really good news for those people, and it's kind of causing consternation for people who have kids who are 19 years old, or for everybody else who is paying for that. So that's the first thing that it didn't kind of go his way. He weighed in on it, and so it just indicates that there is some tension. It's not something that he has complete power over. The other one is the border closing. You'll remember that on December 1st, they came down pretty hard. The fifth wave of COVID infection seemed to die down. People were going out. Restaurants were opening up. And then there was some reports from South Africa that a new variant had come up. We all know that now to be the Omicron virus or variant. And immediately the Ministry of Transportation kind of went overboard, and they instructed airlines to cease issuing tickets for travelers. The Prime Minister's office didn't hear about that until 2 or 3 days later, and it ended up he had a lot of egg on his face. A lot of people were upset about that, and so he had to back up on that. They did relieve a little bit of the pressure on people coming in, but it still was very close to something of a lockdown. They increased the number of travelers who could come in under certain criteria, but they kept out most of the academics and the foreign students, and that caused a lot of kind of animosity with Japan's closest partners, because Japanese students and academics are traveling freely to other countries, and the Japanese are resisting and restricting the foreigners to come in. And it just has that feel that for those of us who have lived here for a while, perceive from time to time this distinction that the Japanese kind of make in knee-jerk reactions with regard to the treatment of foreign nationals as opposed to Japanese nationals. So he caught a little bit of flack on that. And then finally, what is he going to do with this pressure from the United States about boycotting diplomatically the Beijing Olympics? So he hemmed and hawed a little bit. He hasn't actually quite made a firm decision, but with his foreign minister rubbing shoulders so closely with other foreign ministers, particularly Tony Blinken of the United States in London last week, it's hard for him not to go along with the United States. And probably it's the better policy choice, given the affinity between the United States and Japan, particularly on the military end of things. So he has basically said that he's not going to be sending a delegation of the cabinet to the Olympics, but that still remains to be seen who he will send, what kind of delegation will be going there. So it puts him in something of a situation of, waiting to see how the winds are blowing, and that doesn't project a lot of strength. And as we said, Mr. Hayashi was in Liverpool this time last week. They had a 2-day delegation of foreign ministers. And the interesting thing about that is that Hayashi really came off looking really well in comparison with other foreign ministers, Mr. Kishida being one of them of recent vintage. But he came off really well. They had good press reports on him. He played the piano for all of the dignitaries. He is a musician, as I think most of you know. He was the lead guitarist. He's the lead singer of a band that they put together of Japanese politicians called the Gins. Of course, they're all LDP musicians, and they don't perform anymore. They were performing a couple of years ago, but he is a really good guitarist and a rock guitarist. So he can play some licks, and he played the piano, and that generated just having a Japanese defense foreign minister being able to be that affable and with it, I think generates a lot of admiration for Japan, and I think he did a great job there. And the reason why I'm waxing on this is because we have this issue. It hasn't quite come to a head yet, but we have this issue with the election of the Yamaguchi that's coming up the next time we have an election of the lower house. The seat where Mr. Hayashi sits is the same election district for Mr. Abe and also Mr. Kishi, who is the defense minister. One of them is going to have to go. And so how they burnish their reputations and their images as we move forward is something that you need to keep an eye on. And when you see it, just notice it for what it is. So, for example, this issue with the Moritomo suicide that I talked about, and also Sakura o Mirukai, the annual flower viewing fundraiser that was run by Mr. Abe's organization, and generated a lot of good. Also, it was kind of funny business, and that only came up towards the end of his administration, and so he caught a lot of flack. He's still catching flack for that. So when you see that, you see this tension between Mr. Abe and Mr. Hayashi. Mr. Hayashi's playing the piano. Mr. Abe's, the scandal is still, it hasn't died out yet. You'll see more and more of that as we go forward. So look forward to Mr. Hayashi receiving a lot of good press and being very prominent. And I think that would be something natural because of the geopolitical situation that we're in right now, but also because of his personality and his closeness to Mr. Kishida. As you'll recall, he's number 2 in the Kishida faction. So there's a lot brewing there. Let's move on to what's going on with COVID. The Japanese government just approved the new Moderna vaccine booster. So we've gone from AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Moderna as vaccines. And with Japan, the Pfizer was the more popular of those vaccines, probably, I think, a 5-to-1 preference of Pfizer over AstraZeneca and Moderna. And so we're kind of through that phase. The Japanese nation passed the other G12 countries in terms of proliferation of the vaccine. So they're standing in good stead there. And the next phase there is the booster shot. So there's a general consensus now that the original shots, you get the first shot, you get the second shot. And then within 6 months, it was 8 months, they've reduced that to 6 months now, you need to have this booster shot. There are a lot of commentators who say that this is just going to go on forever and ever, and we're always going to be paying the pharmaceutical companies for this endless supply of boosters for the very many variants that are expected to come up. But in any event, this is the first worldwide pandemic. It is possible that there will be others, and this is probably smart business. So the news there is that the Moderna has been approved, and also Pfizer has come out with an oral vaccine, which looks like it's got great prospects. It's in terms of efficacy, it's only at about 80, 89, 88% efficacy compared to the shot, but it is easier to transport, easier to consume, and that sort of thing. The Japanese government has requested Pfizer to increase production because they're not, the numbers and the distribution is expected to be not up to speed. So they're really pressuring Pfizer. The prime minister actually called the CEO of Pfizer to say, please, pretty please, can you hurry that up so that we can get that out? So you've got to imagine countries who are in less of a financial situation as Japan is. Japan's the third largest economy in the world. Other countries are in not such a great situation. So you've got to imagine with the push that the Japanese are doing, how other countries are dealing with that. It must be a difficult political challenge. Not only that, but financial as well. Moving on, the Japanese government revealed in diet hearings that the Japanese Ministry of Construction has falsified records due to construction data, and that this has been going on for a long time. This is another kind of swipe at Mr. Abe in conjunction with the Moritomo scandal news that just came out. So let me just talk about those two because they're instructive, not only in kind of revealing a little bit this tension between Kishida and Mr. Abe and how we're going to help Mr. Hayashi win the election for the lower house when that one seat evaporates, but also to separate the Kishida administration from the Abe administration. Mr. Abe is still in the picture. He's healthy. He's looking good. He is the head of the largest faction in LDP politics right now. He is a force to contend with. And you can see not only the consternation that Mr. Kishida has in working within that construct, but also in distinguishing himself as different from Mr. Abe. Mr. Abe's three arrows. Now we're on to the new economy, the new way that Japan is going to double income. That's his vision. So you will see this over and over again. With Moritomo, just to give you a refresher on that, Moritomo Gakuen was a school in Osaka that Mr. Abe's wife was the titular head of, the principal listed on the documents of the school. I think she was actually just an advisor, but she was very close to the people who were setting that up. And it was a very nationalistic oriented school teaching Japan's history and the wonders of being Japanese and nationalism, that sort of thing. And they got a sweet deal on a piece of land in Osaka. And this created a huge scandal of Mr. Abe meddling in, local politics to help a supporter. And over the years of the scandal, they didn't become very much supported because they were the two principals who were building the school, a gentleman and his wife, basically got thrown under the bus and were arrested and really raked through the coals. This scandal has not died. And in the diet hearings about how this came up, the finance ministry was grilled in the diet about how this happened and what the costs were, how much it cost and how much they paid for it. And it turned out that people who was testifying really doctored the documents. And those documents were found out to be doctored. And the person who was ordered to doctor the documents committed suicide, a Ministry of Finance individual, upper level. He wasn't the one that was reporting to the diet. It was his boss. But because he was ordered to do that, and he was a dedicated bureaucrat and a patriot, and he would never do anything so slimy, but he was ordered and forced to do that, he couldn't live with himself, and he killed himself right around the time of these diet hearings. So it enhanced the suspicion about what was going on there. And all of this was under Mr. Abe's watch, obviously, and Ministry of Finance minister was Mr. Aso at the time. The Japanese district court, on Thursday, basically closed that investigation. The wife was suing the Japanese government for her husband's suicide. The Japanese government was denying that there was any implication of that, and they were fighting it tooth and nail. And then finally on Thursday, they just gave up the boat, and they said, we're going to close this. We're going to pay off the widow, and we're going to, pretend like this never happened and move on. So it's kind of an admission of, yes, we got caught, and trying to move on from there. The thing that's interesting about that is, at the same time, the disclosure of the Ministry of Construction falsifying these records to boost GDP, all during the time that Mr. Abe was in office, under his, Abenomics and the 3 arrows and that sort of thing. It looks like on reflection, maybe that wasn't as positive as possible. And if you're the prime minister now, and you're always being compared to the wonders of the Abe administration, you've got to be able to do better than that. If that's based on cooked books, that's important to you. So you're going to see a little bit more of this going forward, I think, probably as we march towards spring. So just keep your eye on that. They've identified 2. They'll probably identify some other ones. Also mentioned was the Sakura Omirukai, which was the flower blossoming festival that was held by Mr. Abe's election campaign. You'll hear more of that. I'd like to move on to constitutional reform and the defense. So the defense ministers and the foreign ministers are slated to meet again. It's been a while, but they will meet, I believe, in Washington, D.C. They were just, the defense ministers and the foreign ministers meet pretty regularly with the Japanese and the Americans. This is pretty critical. They will be meeting on January 7th. So, maybe 2-3 weeks away from today. The issue with what's going on in Taiwan and Japan's response to it, and what is the obligation of Japan should a hot conflict emerge, is one of the issues that the Japanese need to confront. Mr. Abe went on record just this last week and said he doesn't hold a ministerial portfolio, obviously, but he does carry considerable sway, and he wants to continue to be perceived as wielding this considerable sway that he has. He said publicly that should the United States be attacked in its defense of Taiwan, should something happen there, Japan is obligated to go to its defense under the interpretation of what's the word for it? Collective self-defense, which is in the Japanese constitution. So his interpretation of that is, should the United States, who is kind of the protector militarily of offensive capabilities for the defense of Japan, should they be attacked, then the Japanese government needs to weigh in as a form of collective self-defense in aiding and assisting there. Who knows what that actually means in terms of actual implementation of, defending them, if that means offensive or defensive capabilities. But we're moving in that direction. And interestingly enough, there is a committee dealing with the constitutional revision. And we've heard about that. The LDP is very much in favor of it, but it's difficult to get everybody on the table. The opposition parties don't want to have anything to do with it. They don't want the LDP to have that much power to do it. But now with the last election behind us, and the LDP with their coalition partner, and in fact even Ishin saying that the Constitution needs to be revised to adapt to current circumstances. And so this committee met this last week, and so the forces towards constitutional revision and those against constitutional revision are becoming more clear now. They finally had this meeting. It was instructive because the major opposition party, the Constitutional Democratic Party, has said that they are against constitutional revision, and opposed to them is the LDP, Ishin, a couple of the other minor parties. Komeito is less favorable to it because of its philosophy, but as a coalition partner, it might just abstain or vote for certain parts and just abstain from other parts. But it looks like that is moving very quickly forward. These meetings are extremely important, and this coalescing of thought on what parts of the Constitution we will revise are becoming more crystal clear. And I think before the election of the upper house, this is going to be geared towards a referendum vote, probably maybe either before the upper house or immediately after the upper house, as a kind of a temperature read of the entire nation. What are we going to do about revising the Constitution? The reason why it's important is the Constitution has never been revised, and the fear is that once it becomes revised, even in a minor part, at least it sets a precedent for how we can do it moving forward. But in fact, part of the discussion on revising the Constitution is a pretty tough one. Are we going to have a peace constitution, or are we going to have offensive capabilities? Are we going to acknowledge the existence of the Japan Self-Defense Forces as a true military power? So that seems to be the general theme. Everybody pretty much agrees to voting on that particular issue, in addition to other issues such as how is the Diet going to be run in an emergency situation? What powers do we have under a kind of a pandemic situation? These kinds of really topical issues. They want to be able to revise the Constitution to deal with those. So I think this will come up towards a referendum vote towards the spring. And also, I think you can anticipate some sort of a critical event to happen, maybe North Korea, maybe China. I don't think Ukraine, unless Ukraine triggers something here in Southeast Asia. But I think that there will be some event that happens where the Japanese population gets into a bit of a panic, and then we move on that referendum vote. So please stay tuned to that. And I think there's lots to look forward to in terms of generating global attention on Japan for revising the peace constitution. I kind of think it's somewhat inevitable given the circumstances. So, for example, the Ministry of Finance, the Foreign Ministry just opened a new office in Taiwan, something very unusual. It's not a diplomatic post. It is through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's a new office to enhance information gathering and to see what's going on in the straits there. It's an issue that will trigger China's ire. You will hear a lot about that. They get mad at everything. I mean, there was you might remember Joe Biden had his conference on democracy, worldwide democracy, and in that presentation, day-long presentation, one of the presenters was a Taiwanese talking about the situation there, and posted a map on the back where Taiwan was a different color from the rest of China. And it stayed up on the video screen for a little bit, and then pretty soon the screen went blank. And it was because of somebody in the Biden administration pulling that off, because that could generate China's ire on this person's presentation, not endorsed completely by the United States government, but as presenting to worldwide democracy. It's such a sensitive issue that even the Biden administration pulled that off the screen, and then the screen went blank. The audio continued on. But this issue of generating any kind of animosity from the Chinese, and it's very easy to do when you're talking about Taiwan, really generates a bit of an overreaction and retribution. So that looks like that will be a very hot issue. You know, there's a lot going on with Ukraine and the forwarding of forces by Mr. Putin on the borders there. It's causing a lot of tension. That is not always done in isolation. So it's a worrying issue to keep, an eye on that, and also the China Strait. So I endorse everybody to listen in. Dr. Stephen Nagy wrote about this in the Japan Times. I think it was Tuesday of last week. He's a prolific writer and thinker about this, and he's also one of the speakers on Japan Expert Insights. Mai has a room for him every other week, and he gets into these issues far more deeply than I'm able to. So I endorse you taking a look at that, because it does have a great impact on what's happening here. Finally, I'd like to talk about GoTo Travel. GoTo Travel was a scheme, maybe a plan to enhance the travel industry in Japan. So in 2001, there was 4.7 million tourists who came to Japan, 4.7 in 2001. And in 2019, there was 32 million tourists in Japan. And I know everybody that's on the call knows this, because even people who were traveling to Kyoto during the summer of 18 and 19 were, just always commenting and astounded by the number of Chinese tourists that were there. And it was becoming less comfortable to do that and to be there. But this turned out to be just pumping tremendous funds into the Japanese economy, 4.5 trillion just from the foreign influx of tourism into the Japanese economy. That's in addition to the 20 trillion just by domestic travel. So this idea of boosting travel and encouraging tourism, not just the foreign tourists, it's mostly domestic tourists. If you look at the foreigners coming into Japan, there was 4.5 trillion boosted into the economy compared to 20 trillion by the domestic industry. It's really the domestic industry that's driving that, but it sure is sweet to get the foreigners to come in, leaving their money here and then going back and not weighing too heavily on the social infrastructure of Japan. it's not quite, but it's almost like free money. So they wanted to do that. COVID brought a 61% drop in 2020, of course, 60% drop in those funds and in tourism, but it also brought that 4.7 million, 32 million foreign travelers to zero. So there's been basically zero travel of the foreigners coming in and pumping that money into the economy. And the domestic tourism fell 50%. So the tourism industry, the travel industry here, it's a barometer, it's a progenitor of the rest of the economy, and the Japanese government has identified that and wants to relaunch that. They're going to do it before December 31st because the borders are essentially closed. They have increased the number of people who can come in, but it doesn't include the academics and the students who are in a long line waiting to get in. So a lot of these guys are going elsewhere in the world to pursue their PhDs and to finish their master's degree, that sort of thing. It's really been going on too long, and when you're 18, 19, 22 years old and trying to finish your education and the Japanese government is not letting you come in, you will go elsewhere. So the prognosis right now is that it's difficult to say, but probably February or March, all things being copacetic, that GoTo Travel will kick off again, and with the digital passports for COVID restrictions being launched. That actually was launched at the beginning of this month, is beginning to take off now. They have a iPhone and an Android version, and that should be taking off not only for travel within Japan, but also reciprocal for Japanese going elsewhere and being able to walk into a restaurant and have at least some sort of indication that you have been vaccinated. So there's a lot of problems going on throughout the world where you have to show your vaccination proof, or you have to wear your mask, and you're going to be arrested if you don't wear your mask. There's a lot of stuff going on all over the place, and the Japanese are trying to figure out what exactly their reaction is going to be. Finally, I'd like to just give you a temperature read on what's going on in LDP factional politics. This is very brief, and it's not really replete with a lot of rich textured information, but it is something that we need to keep our eye on and watch constantly. And that's because the LDP has a position of power within Japanese politics. And if it's the LDP that you have to watch, then what's going on within that? And it's like there are 7 political parties all coalesced into one party called the LDP. It's a big circus tent of various factions, 7 factions. And what's going on with those factions is really important. So we talked about Mr. Abe. There are maybe 6 viable factions right now. There's the Abe faction, the Aso faction, the Motegi faction, Mr. Nikai's faction, and Mr. Kishida's faction. There were 2 other factions that we were talking about even as recently as 2 weeks ago. The Ishihara faction, Nobuteru Ishihara, and the Ishiba faction. The Ishiba faction has ceased to exist. It has dissipated and it no longer exists. So the members of that faction are now independents and are likely to be picked up by other factions. The Ishihara faction just closed out this last week. You might remember, if you were listening to this briefing last week, is that Mr. Ishihara lost his election, his lower house election, even though he was the head of his faction. It wasn't a huge faction, but it had about 11 members. And he wasn't elected. He wasn't reelected, which is a big shock. But Mr. Kishida asked him to be an advisor on his team as a cabinet advisor. That's a pretty big deal. And he's not even a member of the Diet. But for some reason, he felt obligated to do that for Mr. Ishihara. That only lasted about 5 or 6 days, because it turned out that the COVID funds that are being paid for people who are working from home or to supplement their income, that money that was being paid to Mr. Ishihara's employees of his political office, it turned out that he wasn't relinquishing that money to them. He was earmarking it for other purposes. That hit the press on Thursday. Bunshin reported that, and he got a phone call from the prime minister relinquishing him of his very nice appointment as advisor to the cabinet. That was kind of the last bell for his political faction as well, and so it has formally disappeared. So with Mr. Abe, you've got 95 members. With Aso and Motegi, they're neck and neck. They both have 53 members. Mr. Nikai, who was pretty much the biggest loser in the last election, that saw Mr. Kishida become prime minister, he has 44 members. So even though you might lose that kind of a fight, your political faction members are unlikely to ditch you. It's not quite like that. It requires something a little bit more than that. But he still retains 44 members. And depending on how things roll, he could collect some, he could lose some. But the jury is still out. Mr. Kishida has 42 members. The current prime minister has the fewest number of members in his political faction, which is interesting because it means that he needs to rely on coalitions. He has a great coalition with Mr. Motegi, who just became the head of his faction after the former head passed away. So this dynamic is fluid, and it continues. So these factions have political parties all the time. I went to 3 of them over the last 10 days, and they're pretty much the same speakers. If it's Mr. Motegi's political faction meeting, his party, he will open it up and he will talk to the collected crowds. And in each of these, there were thousands of people, at least 1,000 people in each of these. But Mr. Motegi will speak, and then he might have the Speaker of the House speak, who is Mr. Hosoda, who was the Abe faction head. At the election of Mr. Kishida, he resigned as faction head because he was appointed as Speaker of the House, a very powerful position, allowing Mr. Abe to become the head of the Abe faction at that point. And then you would have maybe the Prime Minister speak, and then Mr. Abe spoke, and then Mr. Aso speaks, and certainly not Mr. Nikai was invited, but you had all of these people who are running their factions speak at each other's political fundraising parties. So it's kind of dual scratching of backs, but it goes on a daily basis, and how Japanese politics moves, how regulations are implemented or refined, it all happens at that level. So it's something to watch. I'm intensely interested in it. I'm following it and participating to the degree that I can, and I'll report on it to you on a regular basis because it is of such importance. I've gone on really long. I apologize for that. There's a lot of things that we could have spent more time on, and there's some things that we didn't even get into. So what I'd like to do, Maya, is open the room and ask other people. And otherwise, God, I'm just fearful of the 20 questions you're going to ask unless somebody comes up and helps me here.
Yeah, you're right to be fearful. I'll start with the 20 questions. The first one to you, Timothy, is, do you have any comments about the opening of the borders? Because we heard that the government intended to keep the borders closed because of the new Omicron variant until December the 31st. However, now there are some maybe rumors that they will extend the period of border closures until, I don't know, some point in January or even later. So if you have any comments on this, please.
Great question. So it is unlikely, almost infeasible for them to back off on the December 31st. It's unlikely that they will say the spread of the infection and the power of the infection of the Omicron variant is so weak that we're going to back it off a little bit. It's unlikely that that's going to happen. It is more likely, number one, that they move the ball forward to sometime in January, maybe even February. The second likely outcome is that they will stick with the December 31st deadline. I don't think that that's going to happen. So what's triggered this is the variant has escaped into Japan. There's an astounding number of 7 or 8 cases coming in from, the last one came in from Texas. So a Japanese national came in and didn't pay attention to her, the requirements that she stay in the hotel and she doesn't see anybody. Apparently her boyfriend came over and then he went to a soccer game. And so this is creating a lot of consternation. But it's only, 8 people so far. It might have increased a little bit, but they've also, the data shows that it's not that virulent. It is not hurting people. It is not killing people. I don't know if anybody has actually died of the Omicron variant. So that data is coming in and I think will be analyzed and then decisions will be made accordingly.
Deadly, if I can say, there are no reports about people who have passed away or who have been killed by it. In the government, are they keeping the borders closed because they fear the public opinion? Or what is really?
I don't think it's because they fear the public opinion. I think it's just, the people are just very highly risk averse.
Yeah.
Almost to the point of being destructive, they are risk averse. But you've seen this in other countries too. I mean, the United States as well. And the United States is not known as being very risk averse, but the Japanese are. And I think that really is the biggest explanation. Nobody wants to be criticized. You became a prime minister, 6 months ago, and these people died because of your policies. We had 6 people die in the country, and it's your fault. Nobody wants to hear that. Even if the criticism is, the economy's in the tank because of your policies, that's probably a more acceptable outcome than somebody died because of your policies.
Yeah, and that the economy is really in a very bad state of affairs at the moment. It's just, I wonder whether if they continue to keep the borders closed, and some of the industry obviously are not, I mean, they're suffering from these border closures, like the travel industry and the hospitality industry as well. So will the government continue helping those industries survive by giving them, subsidies and
Money? Yes.
money? Yes. And if the
Yes.
government does that, where does all that money come from? So there
Yeah.
are so many questions which are left unanswered. And yeah, as you said, we fear something which is not so dangerous, seems to be not so dangerous at this point of time. So it's, wow. Anyway, well,
Yes. Well, where does the money come from? Yeah, that's a very curious question. So apparently Japan has lots of money. These national governments have lots of money. The Japanese government just announced that it was going to donate $1 billion to helping other countries who are less economically able to weather the COVID storm. And this was like a donation that they've given to the international body to distribute. So some people could say, that money could be better spent here in Japan, but I think they don't need to have that argument. They already have enough money here. They just either get it through debt financing or they print more money. But what the budget that they just passed for supplementary help for COVID reaction, and the whole dream here is that we prime the pump and we get the economy going. People start coming back to Japan. They feel more enthusiastic. They feel better about the future, and they start spending money. I think that that's likely. I think that there's so much pent up demand, and also if Mr. Kishida is successful in forcing the companies to increase wages. I mean, the wage expectation now is only raise wages by about 4% or 5%. That'll be great. That seems so minimal to me, but it looks like that even something of that magnitude is going to trigger this this pouring of hope and let's buy a car, let's build a house, that sort of thing, and that's what we need to happen here.
Yeah, you have to start from somewhere, indeed, but well, let's see how it goes. And yeah, because in other countries inflation has already kicked in, and then well, obviously we have seen increase of prices in Japan as well, but the wages remain the same. Ren, good morning. Thank you for coming.
Good morning, Ren. How are you?
Good morning. How are you? I just want to say about the Kishida's administration being extremely careful about what's happening this time, and I think this is my view, and I think a lot of people share my view as well. Is that you may remember the Diamond Princess?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
That's how it all started, wasn't it? And it was all
Yes.
those foreigners. Yes, great.
That's right.
A great comment, Ren.
No, it's I didn't try to blame any foreigners, but it also coincided with the president of China, Xi Jinping, was planning to visit Japan, and of course it was cancelled after that. So I think Abe administration was criticized for being putting politics or international politics ahead of Japanese citizens' health, and at that time, as you may remember, WHO's information was conflicting, and it took them 2 votes to finally vote that this COVID was a pandemic. The first vote was voted down. So I think Mr. Kishida tried to be extra careful to begin with, and then slowly turning the novel a little bit toward the lighter side as we understand more about Omicron. Because a few weeks ago, people didn't know how serious or how less serious Omicron. So I hope, I think Maya also hopes this as well, that now we understand better about Omicron. I think they're going to turn the severity level a little bit toward the lighter side, maybe each week. And there's I think we can debate whether that is the right approach or not, but I think it is quite obvious that they want to start with on the harder side and then go toward the softer side instead of the other way around when Mr. Abe was, when the Diamond Princess incident happened.
Yes, I certainly hope they will. But you know what is worrying me, Ren, and I guess that a lot of people who have suffered, whose businesses have suffered from this, border closure, is that we see in European countries. Well, of course, some people have passed away. They have been killed by the new variant. But still, when you think in perspective, the number of those people is very small. It's still the European countries are closing down. They're instituting lockdowns again because of the new variant, and I think that the people whose businesses have been affected here in Japan, they fear that the same thing will happen in Japan, and
Right.
yes, and I understand what you're saying about the government, that they are very careful now, so that they don't want to be to receive the same comments as the Abe administration did in the beginning of 2020.
Right. I think it is interesting to point out France also. I think they blocked any visitors coming from UK, right?
Yes, they did.
Because UK, the Prime Minister Johnson or his health minister basically said, we have Omicron all over the place in our country, so there's no point to do the border shutdown. It makes no sense to do border shutdown now.
Yes.
And that comment was probably logically correct. Politically correct or not, I'm not sure because I'm not a politician. But I think it did. I think it was right after that, right? France blocked UK travelers into the country.
Yeah, I think it was right after that, but I may be mistaken, so sorry if I am.
Yeah, and if I can make one more comment, a completely different feedback to Timothy's point. This will be a short one. This is about Audrey Tan. I think, Timothy, you were talking about the gentleman from Taiwan who participated in President Biden's Democracy Summit.
Right.
Right. And that gentleman is Audrey Tan. And my understanding from my reliable sources is that the slide that he used was a data from some kind of non-profit organization that showed which country is more democratic, more freedom, more those kind of stuff, and that map showed Taiwan with a different color from the color being used in China. And the story was that there was a rehearsal of this event, this summit, and some kind of accident happened that the PowerPoint presentation prepared by Miss Audrey Tan in that rehearsal did not include that slide.
Right.
And the if that slide had been included in the rehearsal, the senior administration or even President Biden would have approved it, but they didn't see that, so they didn't have a chance to approve it in advance. And when the real summit happened, then that slide was shown, and those people who are controlling the video feed or video live streaming are not necessarily the high-ranking officials of the U.S. Department of State. So, and these people are more been trained to be careful with China, not to provoke China, and they don't have authority to make that kind of high-level decision. So they went into the easier route by just shutting down that video of that particular slide, which showed Taiwan as a different country or different color from China. So this all makes sense because White House later officially announced that the White House did not instruct anyone to cut off that video feed of that slide at that time. So this all makes sense because it was the low-ranking, or should I say, the ordinary ranking diplomats who had to make that decision at the split of a second, which is too much to ask from these people, right? So it's unfortunate that this happened, but I think I'm telling some of my friends who are strong supporter of Taiwan. They are angry with the Biden administration. They think Biden administration caved into China's pressure and things like that. I think, well, I think you need to have more trust on Biden administration when they said that their commitment to Taiwan is rock solid. I think it is still rock solid. This was just an accident. So that's my view. I don't know if this is helpful to you or not, but just wanted to comment on this.
No, it's great insight, and I appreciate you sharing that with us. The point I was trying to make is that the U.S. administration is so cautious that even something like this, that it's not suggestive that Taiwan is a separate entity. Like you said, the color was attributed for a different aspect, but even something that could be misinterpreted is yanked because we don't want these guys to get mad at us. Just indicates some position of weakness that things like this happen. If you read the details, it was on level of democratic proliferation in the country. So get off my back and complain about something that has more reality based. But it's true. It's such a delicate time, and it's it's one of the reasons we have to watch this very carefully. And if the United States is like that, and should it come to a conflict, what is Japan going to do? What is South Korea going to do? South Korea decided that it wasn't going to join the boycott of the China Olympics, which shows just another one of those gaps in between a united approach to how we, the collective we, are going to deal with China moving a little bit more aggressively on achieving their ends. So that's, right. I think, the big point there.
Yes, and that makes Abe's comment a week ago only that much significant, right?
Exactly, sure. And not only that, but also this movement now of the constitutional revision. Yeah. It's always great to get your insight, Ren. Thank
you.
Yeah, thank you. We talked a little bit about the subsidies and the hands out which the government now is planning, yes, to families with children and also to the businesses that cannot operate well because of the pandemic. I wonder how this connects to Mr. Kishida's the idea of new capitalism and his committee, of actually committee on new capitalism.
New capitalism. Yeah.
So because he set up that committee and it has been debating, I believe, for a month or over a month now. So if you have any insight on this, it will be interesting to hear it too.
Yeah, I don't think that committee's debating anything.
Okay.
I think they're planning forward movement, and it consists of Mr. Kishida and Mr. Motegi, two very important, influential people, and some other high-ranking people within the administration. So they are designing a way to move forward. The supplemental budget, I think it's a bit of a separate issue. It's let's earmark funds for these kinds of things. The policy implications are on how it is implemented, how we spend this money, who comes in with a request that gets treatment, as opposed to those who come in with a request that don't get treatment. So in the implementation of that, you'll see a little bit more of what his design is. But already there's a bit of a fight brewing between the prime minister's desire. His real desire is to double income, and I don't think anybody agrees that that's feasible. But first of all, let's start with at least raising wages. And there are two problems there. One is where does this money come from? How do we force companies to increase the wages of their employees? And the second is, if the economy is still in the doldrums, what's the justification for that? I mean, you've got to come up with something. So Keidanren is opposed to this increase in wages, but it is an association of the companies. It's not an association of the employees. The association of the employees is basically the union of workers, and it's a coalition of many labor unions. They're the ones that are fighting and coming up with the 4% that I talked about suggesting. So in spring, there is a spring offensive called Shunto. This is when all of the labor unions come together and they say, before April, we want movement on this. We want wages. We want home leave. We want work from home. These are our demands. We are the workers of the world. We demand this, and we emerge through that. And then Shunto finishes. They have negotiations, and then we move on until the next year. But I think with the new capitalism, it's still undefined. They're still trying to figure that out, and I think they can walk and chew gum at the same time. But I think just getting through this extraordinary diet took up more of the time than they could devote to something like the new capitalism. So I think with the end of the diet session on Tuesday, and without all the lights and cameras and all of the insistence that they make, the press and the public make on them, I think between now and the new diet session, which will be on the 17th, that's a long period of time. I think they'll have time to take a little bit of a break, maybe a bit of a vacation internally, but also make progress on what this new capitalism is going to mean. And everybody's curious about it. It's as yet somewhat ill-defined. And the tug of war here is, sorry to go on a little bit longer, the tug of war here is, do we give them money first and then hope that it generates better productivity so the economy takes off? Or do we insist the economy takes off and it produces this wealth so that we're justified in giving people the money afterwards? So that's the tug of war that's going on.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the labor unions, and it seems that the labor unions here in Japan are not really that strong. They don't hold the power which labor unions in other countries do. So and obviously the association or the federation, the Keidanren, the business federation here is so much stronger, and of course it seems to be in how can I put it? It seems to be much closer to the government as well. When you think about Keidanren and the labor unions and compare those relations, so obviously Keidanren is much closer to the government.
Yes. Well, yeah, the government, I mean, the LDP stands for big business. I mean, that's basically the description of it. Komeito is the softer face of that. Komeito is more towards lower income, the people at large, and they have a more compelling policy. But the force of the labor movement here has basically been eviscerated over many years. It used to be very strong, very powerful. I think a lot of people who are in this call have been here for a while and are seeped in history Japan hands. There was a time when Shunto was a very big deal, and there were lots of demonstrations. And I think that just collectively, big corporations and law firms and the government has worked more successfully to diminish their power and to make the unions less appealing to the workers. And so there are a lot of industries are unionized, but there's a lot of distrust and a lot of disdain for union activities within corporations, within companies. It isn't what it used to be. So I think that's part of the power sway that goes on, even when you talk about it in the press and read about it. People don't hold the labor unions up as they once did as the champions of the workers, as the right thing to do. I think it was just so much bad press has been generated as a result of that.
Yeah, and if I may just point out that that also follows follow in the footsteps of the trend of demolishing the lifetime employment of Japan.
Yes, indeed, there is a trend towards actually getting rid of that trend, and of course we have seen how. Of course, it started, with some public policies that were adopted by the government of Mr. Koizumi, and I think it continued with the policies which were adopted by the government of Mr. Abe. So we are seeing how this, is playing out now, and there is a huge upturn, if I can use the word, in let's say the recruiting market here. There is a huge number of new recruiting companies, which this is a signal, or how the market is actually changing. So people move much more than they did before. Employees don't see lifetime employment. Many of them, not everybody, of course. There is still a huge number of employees here who prefer to stay in the same company, work for the same company during their lifetime. But we see an increasing number of people willing to change companies. So yeah, that's just
Can I throw my two
Please
cents
do,
in here
yes.
too? This is a great part of the dialogue. These recruitment companies have just exploded, and I think the reason why they've exploded. There are a couple of people here on the call who are in the industry actually. So please weigh in if you feel the hand of God on you. Um, the sense now of workers to join and the anticipation of being there for the rest of their life has almost completely evaporated because a lot of people who were lifetime employees and felt like they had a stake in the company. Once things went bad after the bubble economy and Lehman shock and stuff like that, and people started getting fired and pink slips and restructuring and stuff like that, they realized that this was just a game that was being played. It's just a marketing ploy by the employers to keep these workers dedicated and moving forward. And the current market of employees, they seek and they want the dry relationship, not the wet relationship. And the dry relationship means I will go to wherever somebody pays me the most money and I have the ability to expand my skill set. And I'm not dominated by somebody that's just because they're 6 years older than me and they've moved up in that rank, not because they have a skill set or any leadership qualities, but only because of their age in the company. Give me a break. I don't want to work in that kind of environment. And I think and you see just the movement of people working. They it didn't used to be like this. I mean, they would change jobs 2 or 3 times in in a span of 10 years, and that used to be not only unheard of but also just detrimental to your brand and to your reputation and to your resume, and that no longer holds true. So and it is a there's market now. The employees, there aren't enough employees to go around, so I think people are exercising that power. It's just the dynamic is just really extremely.
And if I can add one more thing on what you said, Timothy, that the government annuity or Nenkin, the confidence level among the young
In the
people
toilet.
has been. Yes, thank you for putting it so gracefully. But so if you look at the typical salaryman's retired package, I think 2,000,000 yen or maybe 2,000,000 how much, 20 million Japanese yen, or you'll be lucky to have that. I mean, you cannot live for the rest of your life with that much money, and then, so a lot of them depend on Nenkin, right? The government annuity, and then a lot of younger generation people in Japan, they know by the time they get to 59 years old, something like that, there will not be Nenkin waiting for them. So so that also play a major role of this the lack of union support phenomenon,
Right.
as well.
So just I think everybody understands this, but the reason why Nenkin is going to fall is because Nenkin is supported by people who retire, but they're being replaced by people who continue to fill into the employment ranks, paying into the fund. And with the number of people, the population declining so much, the pyramid has been shifted. So there's a lot of people at the top and fewer people at the bottom. And the people at the bottom, they don't have the capacity to keep paying that nisenman to the people who are retiring in huger and huger numbers as we move forward. So that's the basic explanation for it. But what an incredible dynamic, and it's happening here in Japan before it's happening in a lot of other advanced countries, but it is happening in other countries too. So people are watching what's going on here. Maya, you hosted a room with Debbie Howard a couple of weeks ago on the grain of Japan and how to supplement or take care of that part of the economy. It was really interesting. I think if you've got a recording on it and you're interested, you should, for those that are interested, take a look at it.
Oh, yes, that's a good idea. I'll post the link here. And it's on YouTube as well, so it was a very interesting discussion indeed. So, all right. Well, thank you, Timothy. And with
Thank you very much, Maya.
See you next Sunday then. This was Japan Expert Insights Room on Japanese politics. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air next Sunday at 8:30 in the morning, Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Again, we're looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and enjoy every day as much as possible. See you.